Blackboard is you have to basically sign in through a Microsoft login now, which I was able to do because I had an Outlook thing already signed up to try to get into Outlook via let's make sure this was working, via my browser anyway, but that's what that's going on if you've been trying to get into Blackboard. I haven't posted these grades, or the paper grades on Blackboard yet. I'm going to wait until I get on my online stuff. Or not online stuff, the online, damn it. The papers that were sent to me online graded, and those will go on to Blackboard, and then I'll put these on as well. And then, of course, when I get your test graded, which will be first, those will go up there as well. But anyway, point being, if you're trying to get into Blackboard, it's an issue. And I apologize for that. It's especially bad for my online students because they have their test this week, much like you guys have, and they're trying to get into Blackboard, and it's a nightmare for them. So I feel especially bad for them. I've been getting emails from them panicking. And hopefully most of them are seeing this video because they have to get into Blackboard to see the video. I mean, technically they can, if they're following my YouTube channel, they can see it. But I post the video on Blackboard and most of them get it that way, so whatever. Right, I guess one more thing before we start today. We have one test left and then the final. And the way that these chapters come out, this third test and the final will not have 3 chapters apiece. Instead, they will be 2 chapters apiece, due in a couple of reasons, a couple of parts. One, I don't have notes into like chapter 25 or 26. But also, these are big chapters. Like, there's a lot of material. This one here is, I mean, technically it covers World War I, but, like, we were barely involved in World War I. Most of what it talks about with World War I is, like, how it affected the people at home. Because we were involved in World War I for, like, 6 months, maybe. But then there's a whole chapter on the Roaring Twenties, like an entire chapter on 1919 to 1929. So that alone is enough for a test. And then the Great Depression is its own chapter, which again is enough for is a lot. And then of course World War II, which is more than enough for a whole chapter because we were involved in that one quite a bit. Even before the war, before we even got into the war, we were involved in stuff. So, yeah, just FYI, it's going to be 2 chapters apiece for test 3 and the final exam. So, just letting you know, things are changing slightly in that regard. So, let's get into chapter 20. Empire and Wars. And we're not starting with wars, but indeed imperialism. Imperialism being this idea of expanding the territory of one's nation. There's a couple of, the definition varies depending on who you talk to. For some, it's only expanding territory like beyond like a contiguous region. So like us moving west wasn't considered technically imperialism, although we were very much running the people who live there out of their homes to take that land. But very much when we started taking like, say, islands and that sort of thing, that was very much imperialism. But we'll get more into that in a little bit. So after the Civil War, most of our focus was on acquiring Western territories, pushing out the Native Americans, extracting the resources, which again is very imperialistic in its way of doing things, but it isn't like global imperialism. We weren't moving into other parts of the world. We were just expanding westward, which, again, we were mistreating the people that were living there, and like, really, as for those of you that wrote on the gold rush, many of you mentioned that, like, we just were like destroying the landscape to get to the gold, in a lot of cases. So that's something you often would see in colonialism and imperialism from European nations. Still, though, towards the end of the 19th century, which again, 1800s, various aspects within America, economy, social, cultural changes, led people to believe that the U.S. should assert itself on the imperial stage. We should begin expanding not just within our own borders, but globally. And we did. In just a few years, the U.S. acquired Guam, Hawaii, Philippines, and Puerto Rico. There was also a protectorate established in Cuba. We'll get more into that next time. We used the military to build a canal in Panama. We also used the military to intervene in Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Nicaragua because, well, we just did whatever the heck we wanted. And here we have a contemporary image of the time. You can see here 1798, the U.S. Oh, I'm pointing out an image when it's online. 1798, we've just got to the Mississippi River. So this was, pre-Louisiana Purchase. And then 100 years later, you've got the whole continent, well, up to Canada. So, from Maine to essentially California, and then Puerto Rico, as well as, I feel like there were a couple of, technically Cuba wasn't under our control, but we were involved there. Over to the Hawaii, Samoa Islands, Lemoyne, and Manila, which is the Philippines. And I've got a map here in just a minute to show you just how far west the Philippines were, because this map really doesn't do it justice. Because it's a simple simplification of what's going on. Here again is Puck. School begins. Uncle Sam in a new class on civilization. Now, children, you've got to learn these lessons whether you want to or not, but just take a look at the class ahead of you, and remember that in a little while you will feel glad, you will feel as glad you will feel as glad to be here as they are. So you've got, the states back here, and these newly acquired territories. Very racist, because, of course, Native Americans still being put in a corner back here, the Chinese, of course, being left out, and African Americans technically involved, but not included in the classroom. And there's some other things written here and here, but it's not super clear, and we're going to just move on from that. But it's, actually, yeah, here we are. This here is important. This basically says that England governed its colonies with or without the consent of the colonies, and therefore, we became independent because we weren't having that. And now the U.S. must govern its colonies with or without their consent, but it's for their own good because we know what's better. You know, it's fine, right? There's Columbia's Easter bonnet, pushing for expansion and world power. Another one of the planting flags across the world. I don't recall us getting involved in the Canary Islands, but that might have been a minor thing. Canary Islands were, there's a lot going on there. This one also shows Alaska, and that was a later thing, so. Here's McKinley. Again, McKinley was only in office for a year before he got shot, but he did get his hands on a lot of things. So here he is starting the Panama Canal, which again we'll get into more so next time. There's the expansion of America. Lesson for Anti-Expansionists, showing how Uncle Sam has been an expansionist first, last, and all the time. Showing us from the start as, the 13 states, and then gradually growing, and then here we are, not only as, the 48 states, but also with viable colonies, Cuba, Philippines, Puerto Rico. We didn't quite have Hawaii. Oh, we did have Hawaii. Yeah. This year Hawaii was annexed, so 49. Alaska came later. And so now all the nations are friendly because we're a large, expanding nation. Here's the Great White Fleet with Teddy Roosevelt's horrifying head on the front. Here it just says peace. Peace with the doves of peace carrying swords. New diplomacy. We'll look at more of that in a minute. Here we go. This is the map I wanted to look at. Now, granted, this is like, I feel like this is the World War II invasion map, but this is a good depiction of just how big the Pacific was. Now, granted, again, due to the curvature of the Earth, this is still not 100% accurate, but it does show at least how far away, because Hawaii is like way out in the middle of the Pacific. And then further on we have, let's see, there's Midway, Wake Island, there's Guam here. And then the Philippines are actually further west than Japan. I mean, the Philippine Islands are like right under China, just to show how far west the Philippines were. They're still there. It's not like they're gone. But I mean, just, that map before, it looked like they were all right here, but they're actually way over this way, which is going to be important in just a little bit. And then also the other bits we were getting involved in: Nicaragua, Panama, Cuba, Haiti, etc. All right. So obviously this imperialism was due in large part due to economic concerns because, of course, it's about money. Obviously, it's about money. So throughout the early parts of American history, we largely exported agricultural products. We had a lot of farmland, and we exported farm products, especially, the cotton. That cotton was a major export. However, as the 1800s rolled along and America began to industrialize, we started pushing more industrial products out. 1870, American exports was about 500 million, and by 1905 it was tripled to about 1.5 billion. We had companies like Rockefeller Standard Oil Company, Coca-Cola, Kodak, and McCormick. McCormick Reaper, I've actually got an image of what that looked like here in a minute. they're pushing their products out to European and Asian markets because, that's where the markets were. So obviously most of this went to the developed nations in Europe. American businessmen were very interested in opening markets in Asia and Latin America, in particular China, because, well, China's always had a massive population. This is a thing that, if you take my 104 course, it was the exact same in Europe at the time. They were like, we need to break into the market in China because they've got a lot of people, and China didn't want anything to do with it. And then the Opium Wars happened. But America wasn't super involved with that, so we won't really go too much into it, but we were involved with other stuff. A little closer to home, Hawaii was seen as another location that we could break into the market and sell goods to people. In Hawaii, the charge was led by missionaries, which I'll get more into that in a little bit as well. Actually, let me make sure. I just realized I didn't check to make sure that my volume is working. Okay, good. This has been a little late to make sure, but I needed to know. Where is my... There. Okay, cool. Missionaries worked to convert native populations. Businessmen wanted to exploit the sugarcane market. 1893, white plantation owners decided that they just were going to take over the islands. So along with the ambassador to Hawaii and Marines, overthrew the native government of Queen Liliuokalani, then tried to enter into an annexation agreement with the U.S., but again, this was 1893, and if you remember anything from the previous test at all, that was the bad, economic depression times. And also Grover Cleveland was the president, and, he was busy being a bad president. So, even though they had taken over the islands, they were not annexed. So they remained in power and waited for another opportunity to join the U.S. officially. Because they just could take over. They had the military power to overthrow the native government. And they just did. So again, we have Standard Oil, and one of the main reasons he decided to go with Standard as the brand name, is it was hard to make sure you got oil that wasn't watered down or had pollutants in it. Woo, excuse me. There's Coca-Cola again. Back when it really woke you up. I like this one. No game laws for those who hunt with a Kodak. The rod or gun may be left out, but no nature lover omits a Kodak from his camp outfit. It's cool to know that the Kodak company's that old. Oh, also, just as a reminder, going out, let's go out and, take pictures of animals, all sneaky-like, with one of these. Which this was the compact version. You can see that it can accordion back in and close, but it was still probably 5 pounds. And there's the McCormick Reaper. As I mentioned back when I showed you guys that steam-powered tractor, usually pulled by teams of horses or oxen, and it would harvest much more efficiently and then the combine portion behind it would actually like separate the wheat from the chaff, which, you know, was a day-long process oftentimes. Also, there's Queen Liliuokalani. So besides just making money, there were other justifications for going in and, you know, taking land from people. There are, of course, racial arguments for this. Americans and Western Europeans saw themselves as superior to non-whites and had a natural right of conquest because, again, this is, you know, the late 1800s, early 1900s. I mean, the Europeans have been at it for, well, depending on the Europeans, but the English have been at it since forever. However, by this point, there were arguments against imperialism. So there were counter arguments that, oh no, it's not just that we're superior and therefore we can do what we want, but we're superior and therefore it's an ethical concern, and that we are higher civilizations and therefore we need to uplift these inferior people. We're going in for their own good. This was actually an argument on the side of slavery in the South, right there at the end of slavery here in the U.S. was like, oh no, it's for the good of the slaves that we're enslaving them. Josiah Strong in Our Country said the Anglo-Saxon race was superior and should spread the blessings of its Christian way of life all over the world by, you know, going in and invading and murdering lots of people and then putting the rest to work. Because, you know, civilization. So, Hawaii was the one that it focuses on because, you know, it became a state. But this was a common practice, not just in places that America was going into, but really any Western European nation, that these economic aspirations were often connected to missionary work going in first. John D. Rockefeller and Cyrus McCormick created the World Student Christian Federation, sent 5,000 missionaries across the world. China was a major target for this, and was, of course, also a major target for the missionaries. Surprise, surprise. By 1920, missionaries were running schools, hospitals, orphanages, leper colonies, churches, and seminaries to convert these backwards Chinese to Christianity and the American way of life, which is to say, if they're converted to Christianity and, more importantly, the American culture, they will be more interested in consuming American products, thus opening the market to American goods. That was the reasoning. That's what the Europeans were doing too. It's like, hey, if we go in and civilize these people, then they're going to want to buy our stuff. Like the example that my professor used was Britain and India. Like India was another massive population of people, but most of them were like really poor farmers living in grass huts, and like Britain wanted to sell them, you know, Singer sewing machines. And what's a farmer living in a grass hut going to do with a Singer sewing machine? But if you go in and like take over the country and like build roads and train lines and factories and have them buying like clothing that you would use a Singer sewing machine on, then they'll buy Singer sewing machines. Like, it's a long con to get them to buy freaking sewing machines. But that's what a lot of imperialism was. Like, when you hear the word imperialism, you might be thinking like armies going in and taking over land for the good of the mother country. And a lot of that was the case. But a lot of it was also just like, let's go in and make the people want to buy our crap. Because these countries were often very heavily populated, and they wanted all these people to buy their stuff. So we have Josiah Strong here. It is not necessary to argue for to those whom I write the two great needs of mankind. All men may be lived in the light of the highest Christian civilization, our first pure spiritual Christianity, second of liberty, etc. The Anglo-Saxons, as the greatest representative of these two ideas, the depository of the two greatest blessings, sustains peculiar relations to the world's future, divinely commissioned to be his brother's keeper. Again, just this idea that, like, the Anglo-Saxons, which is to say the English and by extension the Americans, are specifically divinely appointed to convert everybody else to their way of doing things. Whether they want them or not, whether they want them to or not. Because, you know, we know better, and it's fine. And some of the missionary groups here. This is the, I already lost the name, World Student Christian Federation. I think McCormick might be in there somewhere. I think I'd recognize Rockefeller. So you've got some folks here in Tokyo Harbor. And some nuns in maybe China? I know this one's China. And, like, for a lot of its history, China straight up outlawed Christianity. And the reason for that wasn't, like, it wasn't as much a religious thing as it was a cultural thing. Because with the change in religion came the change in culture, and, you know, this discarding of old traditions, which was seen as, you know, a problem. Because for most East Asian religions, it didn't really matter. Like, you could be 3 different religions at the same time. In fact, most of the time you were. Like, that wasn't seen as unusual. But the idea of, like, a religion coming in and saying you can't do all these other things anymore was seen as unusual and, like, dangerous. Which most of you were in here for 101. That was very similar to how, like, the Native Americans saw, you know, the Europeans coming over. It's like, hey, here's our God, and you're going to worship him. It's like, okay, cool, we'll just add him to our pile of gods we've already have, and we'll, you know, do that. Like, no, you have to get rid of all your old gods. Like, but why? We've done this forever. Okay, one other thing for this imperialism. Whoops. There we are. There was also gender anxieties because, you know, of course, after the Civil War, many Americans were worried the next generation would not have a chance to test and strengthen their manhood because, you know, the Civil War was such a great thing. We hadn't had a good war in a few decades, and that was seen as a bad thing. And in fact, I'm going to get to a quote here in just a minute, and it's horrendous. And with the Depression in the 1890s, men were unable to support their families as they once had. While Rudyard Kipling's suggestion in his poem, The White Man's Burden, civilized white men were to take up the burden of spreading the light of civilization to the rest of the world. Now, I should mention, because the book doesn't mention this, but my European history book says it this way. Rudyard Kipling was English, and the English are very, very sarcastic all the time. The White Man's Burden, I'm pretty sure, like 99% sure, was satire. But that wasn't taken that way for the Americans. And it's written here in the book. And it doesn't really sound like it's positive when it comes to imperialism. Like, here's just the first stanza. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folks and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. That doesn't sound like you're doing good things for people. I mean, and the next one starts with take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Like, it really sounds like you're just poking fun at the idea of, oh, this is our burden to go and, like, conquer the world. Anyway. There was also, increasing importance of women. Now, granted, this chapter ends in 1918, and if you recall, women don't get the vote until 1919, so women's suffrage is being fought for throughout this period. However, that concern, that possibility had people panicking, such as Alfred Thayer Mahan, who we will get more into in a minute. He believed that women's suffrage would undermine military security because of women's unwillingness to use force. And as I mentioned to my other class, it's like, clearly Mr. Mahan had never met any women in my family. They were the ones you didn't mess with. The biggest call for this imperialism came from jingoists. These people who felt that in order to reassert their manhood, men should engage in warfare across the world. This was folks like Theodore Roosevelt and also Mahan. In agreement with this, Mahan made the statement that just says it all. The name comes from an English verse. We don't want to fight, but yet by jingo, whatever the hell that means. If we do, we've got the ships, we've got the men, we've got the money too. The English always like to fight, especially when it comes to the French. Theodore Roosevelt could not contain their desire to fight a war. You and your generation had your chance from 1861 to 1865. Now let us of this generation have ours. Like, I don't think the Civil War veterans were too proud of having to murder their own brothers, but whatever. Anyway, this is the quote. Captain Mahan, no greater danger can befall civilization than the disappearance of the warlike spirit, I dare say war, among civilized men. There are too many barbarians still in the world. So, like, yeah, there's no greater danger to the world than people not going to war. Sure, dude. So this eventually led to the Naval Act of 1890, authorized the construction of additional battleships. So within 10 years, the American fleet had basically gone from 12th to 3rd most powerful in the world. So I think, and obviously behind Britain and, let's see, so it would have been 1900, maybe Germany or France. But that's pretty impressive, going from 12th up to 3rd in the course of about 10 years. And boy, we were going to put that Navy to good use. Well, I say good use. We're going to put it to use anyway. So we have some interpretations of the white man's burden. So we have one from Judge. The white man's burden, you've got Uncle Sam there carrying our various acquisitions over barbarism, oppression, ignorance, vice, superstition, brutality. Oh, look, slavery. Yeah, because, America and Britain never did any of that. That's John Bull, by the way, Britain. Yeah, because we're the good guys, carrying them towards civilization. Meanwhile, we've got this one, the white man's burden of the people we've subjugated, instead carrying the personification of the nations on their back. So we've got Uncle Sam there, behind him John Bull. I don't know what the name of the personification would be, but that's Prussia behind him, or I guess Germany at this point. And then France behind him. So the 4 major imperialistic nations of the day. I always forget about this one. So remember that real weird, washing liquid thing for the anti-Chinese sentiment? It might have been from last semester. Well, here's Pear's soap. The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Pear's soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances. While amongst this cultured of all nations, it holds the highest place. It is the ideal toilet soap. Toilet being the British word for just like the bathroom in general. Not like the commode. But yeah, here's an ad for a bar of soap that's using imperialism as a way to sell it. It's a thing. The 1800s were weird, y'all. Well, turn of the century. That's why it's, to me, so much fun. It's just so outlandish. Here we are. Here we have progress, cotton, the telegraph lines, railroads. And you've got there on the front, force if necessary, while you've got China and the 400 million barbarians. The force if necessary, that's a Teddy Roosevelt quote. We'll get into that more next time. But they really like using quotes from politicians in these things. We'll get into this more in a little bit. This is the whole thing going on in Cuba. There was a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Conspiracies as to what actually happened. I'll go into what actually happened here in a minute. Oh, there's Teddy Roosevelt with his fleet playing around in the Caribbean. Oh, this one isn't early 20th century propaganda, but it certainly looks like it. Some of you might recognize it, and if you don't, that's fine. But, boy, it looks, it's based on it, so that's why it looks like it. But this is a good one. All right, we're going to briefly talk about Cuba and at least get started on it. because there's a lot going on here with Spain. So, the Cuban War for Independence began around the concept of Cubanidad, pride of nation. I'm getting my classes mixed up. This idea of nationalism that came about after Napoleon, basically this idea of a nation is made up of its people, not due to a leader, etc., etc. Jose Marti, believe liberation from Spain will give impoverished peasants better land, providing racial equality from the recently liberated Afro-Cuban population. So these black Cubans like Antonio Macio joined the rebellion and began filling these high-ranking positions. So the rebels only had about 50,000 men to their name, and the Spanish had about 200,000. Now that's a substantial difference in numbers. However, they were very good at fighting a guerrilla war. Meanwhile, the Spanish were dealing with the disease of Cuba, because Cuba's, like a tropical jungle, essentially. And tropical jungles are full of all sorts of mosquitoes carrying all sorts of fun diseases. And trying to crack down on the rebellion only made it spread. They, would go into the cities and, basically massacre people, which only caused the people who weren't in the rebellion to join the rebellion. 1897, the Spanish government offered a series of reforms to allow home rule, which is to say Cuba would essentially have its own government, but it would remain within the empire, which was a thing that Ireland pushed for forever. And by the time they were finally offered it, they were so angry that they were pushing for full independence. And same thing with Cuba here. By the time they were finally offered it, they were pushing for full independence. They wanted Cuba Libre, or total independence from Spain. And despite, again, the substantial difference in numbers, they could be confident. As I said, a full quarter of Spanish troops fell just from sickness, malaria, yellow fever. The chief military leader, General Maximo Gomez, said his three best generals were Junio, Julio, and Augusto, which is to say June, July, and August. Because that was when, the summer rains came, and therefore the mosquitoes showed up. And as I was, telling my students again yesterday, it just makes me itchy thinking about it. If a mosquito were to be in this building, it would find me. So I can't imagine being in, July in Cuba in the jungle. I would die. I would just die. And it wouldn't even be the disease. They would just suck all my blood out. Also, the war in Cuba spread beyond Cuba. Puerto Rico, Philippines, and Africa, various Spanish holdings in Africa, also began to rebel. So those 200,000 troops that had been concentrated in Cuba were now spread thin across multiple Spanish holdings. Also, the people in Spain, the population, was getting tired of the war. And also by January of 1898, Spanish troops began mutinying in Havana, Havana being the capital of Cuba. So, the war was very nearly over. When you have the Spanish troops in the capital of the country you're trying to fight, turning against your own guys, the war is about pretty much over. It'd be like if General Howe's troops rebelled during the American War of Independence in like New York City, or not New York City, but New York, during our war. And that was their major stronghold. So anyway, here's some Cuban rebels taking down some Spanish forces. Here's an actual photograph of the Cuban rebels. Discontent and wanting to be independent led to the Cuban War of Independence. No kidding. I mean, thanks for that. But, yeah. It's like it being summer outside led to it being hot. It's like, yeah, no shit. Here is what I believe was a Spanish military leader surrendering at a fort. Now, this is a bit of American propaganda that we're going to get into in just a moment. So, the Spanish misrule is bad, obviously. But as you can see, based on the American propaganda, if the Spanish misrule is removed, then Cuba will fall into anarchy. I mean, it's like literally here. The Cuban rebels wouldn't be able to govern. They would just basically burn everything down if America doesn't step in and restore order. Speaking of, we actually had a number of Americans there in Cuba at the time, usually just reporters reporting what was going on, which, again, I'll get into in just a minute. All right. So the War of 1898 is what we called it because it wasn't much of a war with Spain. It didn't last very long, if you can tell from the name. So the Cuban rebels were very much about to win this war. And American policymakers wanted to go in to help out so that we could have a say in what's going to happen in Cuba. Because, we're the good guys. Again, American press played a big part in this. Not really focusing on what we were actually trying to do, which is to say, again, having a hand in the economics of post-war Cuba, but making it a matter of American honor. So we had William Randolph Hearst with his New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer with his New York World, basically going head-to-head to try and outdo the other in who could provide the most lurid, graphic, honestly, bullcrap coverage of the Spanish atrocities. Reporters would go into Cuba to cover every story they could find, and if they couldn't find anything good, they'd make it up. Because, journalism. This became known as yellow journalism, which sparked jingoistic outrage against Spain. Anybody know why they call it yellow journalism? And no, it's not a racist term, because it's Spanish. I mean, it's the Spanish we're fighting. Actually, it doesn't have anything to do with the Spanish. For those of you that are actually paying attention. So back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Well, I guess technically even today, because my dad used to work at a paper mill. Paper isn't, when it's made, it doesn't come out white. It's kind of a brown, yellowy color. And it's got to be bleached to be nice and white and clean. So Hearst and Pulitzer would just order the yellow stock because it was cheap and you could get it quickly, because they were running these papers so fast that they needed to get the cheapest paper possible, because they were just like constantly putting papers out as quickly as they could to try to, outdo the other. So when you would go to like a newspaper stand and you'd see over to the side this like slightly curled up, blotchy yellow paper, you knew that was the stuff coming out of Cuba that was probably, well, you might not have known it wasn't true, but you knew that was the stuff coming out of Cuba. That was that yellow journalism. So there was a letter published that claimed the Spanish minister in Washington called McKinley weak, which was a big deal apparently. February 15th, 1898, the battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. First off, why did we have a battleship in Havana Harbor if we weren't in the war? But whatever. We tended to have a lot of battleships in places they shouldn't have been if we weren't technically involved in whatever was going on. But I don't know. We did whatever we wanted. It killed 266 American sailors. New York World shouted the rallying cry, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Obviously, it didn't make sense for Spain, which was losing this war against the rebels, to actually antagonize the U.S., which had a really powerful navy, to get involved in this war. But, obviously the U.S. had it as a really good reason to get involved. Congress declared war on Spain by April 21st. It should also be mentioned that the war proclamation said that Cuba ought to be independent, but only when it was pacified. Not Cuba ought to be independent from Spain, and once Spain is defeated, Cuba will be independent, but Cuba will be independent once it's pacified. That's the important part. They were already thinking ahead. This actually is a little bit later. This is talking about Manila, the Philippines, and we'll get into that later. So here we have Maine sailors murdered by Spain. The Spanish brute adds mutilation to murder. It's not like they were on the ship like hacking bodies up. The ship exploded. There's Guam, by the way. Guam was also, we were just like blasting the crap out of Guam. There's Pulitzer and Hearst. This is, not only are they like cartoonishly drawn and literally fighting over blocks, but they're in these child dresses that that babies will be put in, that were often literally made of old newspapers that kind of doubled as like diapers. So if a baby like pooped himself, you could just like wad it up and throw it away. And the yellow journalism newspapers, which were really cheap paper, made really good baby diapers. So this, I'm sure this was an extremely amusing illustration when it was put out the first time. Here's Uncle Sam cutting down the Spanish colonies. Puerto Rico, Cuba, Philippines should be in there somewhere. Yeah, there's Philippines actually still on the thing. Till the last blow. No longer will brutal Spain be supported by outraged colonies. No, only America will be supported by outraged colonies. We'll get to that. To hell with Spain, remember them. I really like that this thing exists out there somewhere. This is a bit of an illustration. Now I do want to, also Uncle Sam punching Spain like in the teeth. That's not a real good punch. You don't want to aim for like the teeth, but whatever. Uncle Sam does what he wants. I don't know why Uncle Sam's got like a do-rag. Anyway. So yeah, the Maine guy, the Maine was completely destroyed. Now, they did go and investigate to see what happened. Again, the initial thought was, oh, Spain did it. And then, well, what they hit it with? Well, it was a mine in the water, probably. Well, there was no sign of, like, external damage to the ship. Something within the munitions room or the powder room blew up. Which is to say there was either, like, a static discharge in the ship or probably somebody was smoking and, like, the cigarette ash went into the powder room where all the gunpowder is and blew the ship apart. So we went to war with Spain over somebody screwing up. Now, I'm not trying to be a 9/11 truther about this, because I'm not saying this was done on purpose, but this was a mistake that went really well for the people who wanted to go to war with Spain. Anyway, here's the Spanish brute again. Peace in Cuba under Spanish rule, worse than hell. All right. Look a little bit further. Actually, yeah, we'll do this one and then we'll be done. So go to war with Spain. This was a sign of the imperialistic notions that America was pushing towards. Also, after the war began, McKinley began the annexation of Hawaii. It was good that the rebels had actually been, about to win the war, because the U.S. Army only had 30,000 men as far as a standing army. We didn't have much of a standing army at the time. McKinley did mobilize about 200,000 National Guard troops and volunteers, including Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, as we're well aware. Also, our forces were not ready to fight in Cuba, much like the Spanish. They weren't ready for the tropical diseases. They also didn't have battle experience, actually lacked supplies, apparently, and their uniforms weren't ready for the tropical jungles. So we really weren't ready for this. And again, not really weren't ready to fight the Spanish. We just weren't ready to go to Cuba. Also, racism, because of course. Racial tensions, especially the troops mustered in southern ports. I'll just read this one out of the book. Tampa, Florida, where troops gathered from all over the country to be transported to Cuba. Racial tensions exploded one afternoon. Intoxicated white soldiers from Ohio grabbed a 2-year-old black boy from his mother and used him for target practice, shooting a bullet through his shirt sleeve. Retaliation, African-American soldiers stormed into the streets and exchanged gunfire with whites, leaving 3 whites and nearly 27 black soldiers wounded. Reporting the story of this riot, the Atlanta Constitution denounced the wild and demonic conduct of the black regulars, completely ignoring the behavior of the white troops that had started the whole thing. Because, it's the Atlanta newspaper. Despite the fact that we weren't ready, we didn't have very many men. Apparently the only person who really knew what he was doing was Teddy Roosevelt. And even then, he didn't really know what he was doing. The war was over in 4 months. 460 Americans died in combat, which was a lot less than the 5,000 who died due to disease, because, again, disease will kill you a lot faster than a bullet. Secretary of State John Hay called the hostilities a splendid little war, which was something you called wars back in the early 1900s. before World War I happened, and then people were like, man, maybe wars suck. Spain ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the U.S. and recognized the U.S. occupation of the Philippines, which will be where we will start on Monday. But, Philippines. So I just got a couple more images here. People of the Americans charging the Spanish. I do like how you've got the Spanish lines here, but you've got some guy up here like already raising the American flag, even though you've still got Spanish troops like on the fort. So, you know, good on him, I guess. Here we have the one of the segregated black regiments. McKinley administration. Again, the Phrygian cap there. They're like, oh, we saved the Cubans from slavery. We'll discuss that next time. Yeah, speaking of, the America holding his end up. John Bull, again, that's Britain. It's really most extraordinary what training will do. Why, only the other day I thought the man unable to support himself. Philippines, Largine Islands, Puerto Rico, Cuba. And we'll talk about Cuba next time. So, I'll see you guys, I guess Monday.